Now to a huge and potentially dangerous market in US sports gambling. It's grown massively since a 2018 Supreme Court ruling allowed states to legalize it. But at what cost to people's lives? Author and historian Jonathan Cohen investigates this in his new book, and he tells Michelle Martin just what he's found.
Thanks, Christian. Jonathan Cohen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, if you watch any sports on TV, you just see betting all over the place. I mean, you see, ads for betting. You see shows kind of built around betting. At 1 minute, it seemed like gambling and sports were like oil and water. They did not mix. When did this change?
It all changed, or it started to change on May 14th, 2018, when the Supreme Court decision, Murphy versus NCAA, unleashed the floodgates for states to legalize sports betting. And I'll spare you the legalese, but effectively, states had been banned from legalizing sports betting, and the Supreme Court overturned that federal regulation, and now states were free to regulate or legalize sports betting as they so chose.
Just briefly, if you would, what were the grounds? Like, what was the argument there?
The grounds actually had basically nothing to do with sports betting in and of itself. In 1992, Congress passed a law, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA, that barred states from legalizing gambling. And the Murphy versus NCAA 2018 decision focused not on gambling itself, but on this commandeering statute from the 10th Amendment, the idea that basically Congress can't tell states what to do, and that states have a right to legalize gambling if they so choose.
How big is sports betting in the United States?
So over the last just 7 years, Americans have already bet around $500 billion on sports betting. And the estimations are that as many as 20 to 40% of American adults have placed at least one bet on sports. And all of this is before the states of California, Texas, and Georgia legalize sports betting. So when those states and other states like them get in the game, it's going to get even bigger.
The title of your book is Losing Big, America's Reckless Bet on Sports Gambling. So what's the problem as you see it?
And just to be clear, I'm actually in favor of sports betting, and I think it's totally harmless and totally fun for someone to bet $5 on the Cubs to win or whatever team that they choose, and to get a little more excitement out of sports from betting on sports. My issue is the way that this was unfurled, and this way this was legalized and rolled out was, as the word I've chosen to use, is reckless. It was sort of a full-on embrace, or a full all-out blitz, if you want to sort of use the sports terminology, with no consideration for the negative externalities, for the after effects, for the consequences for people who might develop gambling addictions, for young men in particular who might bet more than they can afford, without any information, without any laying of the groundwork for how we could do this safely.
Okay, so let's kind of walk through what are the problems as far as you see it.
The problem are the effects that the current version of sports betting, and I'll say even more specifically, online sports betting has on people. And by people, I disproportionately mean young men between the ages of 18 and 35 who have sort of borne the biggest consequences from the legalization of sports betting. And the very sort of specific, concrete consequences are rising rates of economic insecurity, huge prevalence of young men in particular betting more money than they can afford or more money than they have. A large percentage have admitted that they have been unable to pay one of their bills because of the amount of money that they bet every month. Rising rates of bankruptcies, of credit card delinquencies in states that have legalized online sports betting, as well as sort of the most dramatic evidence, which would be rising rates of problem gambling, as there are lots of different indicators of this, calls to hotlines, texts to gambling hotlines, and then something called self-exclusion. So if I decide, I really just can't control my betting, I need to register with the state, and the state is going to cut me off and they will not let me legally bet anymore. The rates of people in states like Pennsylvania that have self-excluded just in the last 7 years outpaced the entire 12-year period prior to legalization. So we're getting more self-exclusions just in the last couple of years than we saw for a decade plus prior to sports betting legalization.
You profile a couple of people that make the point that you've been making here. One of them was a young guy named Kyle. Why don't you tell me about him?
Yeah, so Kyle was really excited for Colorado to get in the game and to legalize sports betting. And when the state did so in 2020, he downloaded every different sportsbook app, took advantage of every bonus offer. He quickly ran into one of the problems I described, where he sort of didn't realize how much he was betting and couldn't pay his rent one month and had to ask his parents to help him out because he had bet more than he could afford. And he has been able to stop, but he'll go 6 months and he'll fall down this really intense gambling rabbit hole where gambling basically consumes his entire life. And he lost a job because he was in one of these rabbit holes. And when he was up, when he's winning, he sort of had this overconfidence. And then when he would lose, it just sort of shattered his sort of sense of self and his mental health and would lead to substance abuse and all sorts of other attendant problems. So he has since moved back with his parents outside of Wichita, but is still going through these exact phases where he'll go for a few months with no gambling, and then lo and behold, the NFL season starts, and he can't wait to bet on the Chiefs, and here he goes again. He sort of has been unable to bet safely, and this is someone who, by his own admission, would not have bet otherwise if it had not been available sort of legally on his phone. When he goes to a casino, he's really been able to control himself. This is not a gambling problem. It's an online access problem that is the root of his issue.
Interesting. Why is that? You're saying it's because of the online access that it became so consuming. Why would that be?
Yeah, there are many reasons. One of them is the fact that when you're betting online, you can bet on anything. And I don't just mean you can bet on any game, but you can bet on any result within any game, and sort of micro betting. You can bet on, of course, the results of the game itself, but also individual players and their results. And then when the games are over, let's say at 1 a.m. or so, you can bet on Malaysian women's doubles badminton. And people like Kyle, who've sort of developed gambling addictions, they're not actually looking to bet on sports because they love sports at that point. They're looking for action. They're looking for a chance to risk and win money and sort of satisfy their need for action, which is what sort of problem gamblers are actually addicted to.
The thing I have to ask, though, is that in your own reporting indicates that only something like 3% of Americans fall into this category of a problem gambler. And I think some reasonable person might say, well, I'm sorry, that's 3%. This is actually a small percentage of people who are participating who fall into this problem category. So what would you say to that?
I would say a few things. First of all, problem gambling is the kind of issue that has a lot of societal side effects. So there's a study from Australia that every person who's addicted to gambling, either through their financial needs or their psychological needs, their addiction will affect 5 or 6 other people. So you can do the math of 3% of the American population, each of them affecting, or adult population, each of them affecting 5 to 6 other people. All of a sudden, we're talking about tens of millions of people who have been affected one way or another by problem gambling.
Say more about what you think some of the other problems are. And then there's another guy that you profiled named Arthur, who was embezzling money in order to support his gambling habit. And that was a whole, chain of events that I think people could anticipate. But what are some of the other negative effects that you see?
Gambling addicts, people with a gambling problem, have a higher rate of suicide and suicidal ideation than any other form of addiction, because it's a deeply sort of shameful addiction that we have not sort of societally, I think, destigmatized. There's a sense that because it's a financial addiction, that if the person were to, be gone, that their addiction would be gone or all their problems would be gone. And so that I think for the gambler themselves is a huge problem. And societally, I mean, I think we should all wonder or ask ourselves if sports betting was nominally legalized for the purposes of raising state revenue and for the purposes of making money for government. But I think it's worth asking ourselves if it is worth exploiting or preying on these vulnerable people or addicted people for the purpose of raising a little bit of extra money for the general fund.
And why do you say that? Are you saying it's because the bulk of the revenues come from a very small group of people?
That's exactly right. So, I mean, just to take the case of NFL bettors, the 3% you mentioned, the top 3% of NFL bettors in the 2023-2024 season accounted for 82% of sportsbook revenue. So it's not an accident that there are people developing gambling addiction, that there are people betting more than they can afford. It is the fundamental business model. A decline in rates of problem gambling would dramatically impact the bottom line of sports betting and of sports betting companies. And they have a direct financial incentive and a need almost for the perpetuation of people betting more money than they can afford.
And when you took that data to the sports betting companies and you presented these findings, you said, hey, your business model depends on actually people problematically gambling. It's not your casual, hey, I'm having a Super Bowl party, let's throw some money in. It's a small group of people who probably have a problem. What do they say?
So they insist, first of all, that it is not in their short-term financial interest to extract money from bettors. Of course, it actually is, but they insist that what they want to build is a long-term sustainable business where people are betting comfortably and they're not sort of extracting money from Kyle and then extracting money from Andrew and so moving on. In point of fact, that is, of course, what is actually happening and what they've actually built, but they insist that what they want is something that is long-term, that is sustainable. And these companies repeatedly point to this idea of responsible gambling or responsible gaming, which is their pitch, where they'll tell players in advertising or on the apps to play responsibly, which is their sort of, they see it as a get out of jail free card. They say, oh, we told you to bet responsibly. We're campaigning on betting responsibly. The flip side of that, or the implication of that is, if you didn't bet responsibly, it's your fault. And that we told you to bet responsibly, and therefore actual responsible behavior is in the hands of the individual bettor, not in the hands of the billion-dollar corporation enticing them to bet.
The companies, I think, would argue that they are following the law, that they are raising revenue for states, and that, you know, the people who are gambling are adults who are making the decision. It's just entertainment, like any other kind of form of entertainment. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, I'm in favor of people who want to gambling. I'm not in favor of people who have had their dopamine pathways rewired and are on the road to addiction being bombarded with advertising or with VIP hosts sort of texting them in the middle of the night, asking them if they want to bet or if they want to keep betting. I think people should be free to do what they want to do, but we should be able to protect the people who are the most vulnerable at the same time.
Are these betting apps required to issue warnings, for example? Like, you know, like on a cigarette pack, it's required now that they say, you know, this is addictive, it can be harmful to your health. Don't these sports betting apps have similar product warnings now?
I mean, of course, if you scroll to the bottom of your FanDuel app, you'll see the number for the responsible gambling hotline that for you to call. And they'll, in fact, put their responsible gambling tools front and center. But to me, that sort of speaks to the point of they know that these responsible gambling tools are not effective, and data shows that only a fraction of players actually use the responsible gambling tools that limit their own play. So all these tools are optional. The companies love to boast, you know, that all these players looked at their total amount bet over the course of the last month or the last year, which is one of our responsible gambling tools. But the real tools that actually help people gamble responsibly, which are available on the apps, are things like time limits, like deposit limits, like locking yourself out at certain hours. And data indicates that a fraction, and in some cases, a fraction of bettors have ever used these tools because they're completely voluntary. And then not to mention the fact that once you've encountered some harm, once you've developed a sort of a borderline addiction, you're never going to sort of limit yourself artificially and premeditatively. It's just not realistic about how these things are going to work. And yet the companies sort of hang their hats and they say, oh, we are going above the law. We're going above the requirements from states because we are making all these tools available, but they're not actually making them appealing or making them interesting or making them in such a way that people will actually use them.
And what you're saying, though, I think you said, is that actually when the states have basically you have the option of barring yourself from participating in some of these apps. You're saying people are actually doing it. Why is that?
Right. And one of the reasons I'm in favor of a federal framework is I can exclude myself in the state of Connecticut, but that doesn't involve excluding myself in the state of Massachusetts. So a federal framework of some kind would say, okay, John has decided he can't control his betting. He is now banned at all 39 states that offer legalized gambling from legalized gambling services. And I think that is so a state-by-state approach is helpful to an extent, but only takes us so far.
It's so interesting, Jonathan, because it's like, it seems like we're having a lot of conversations as a culture with how we navigate this world of like social media and, you know, just the online experience. Do you put this our hesitancy to deal with gambling and the harms of gambling for the people for whom it is a harm? Is that part of our kind of American kind of libertarianism, like to let people do what they want? Or is it, you think, in general that we're just not really sure how to deal with all these new technologies? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think sports gambling hits at the exact sort of center of those two, where we were okay with gambling and we were okay with people gambling as much as they wanted, generally speaking. But never before has gambling been as dangerous for the gambler as it is now. Never before have, the Las Vegas founders would drool at the amount of data that DraftKings and FanDuel have about every single person who's ever opened their app. And the consequences of that for gamblers is really dangerous. And that's really easy as a result through marketing, through enticements, through other means of people betting more than, in their sober state than they would intend to. So I think I'm generally agree with you, sort of inclined towards this libertarian streak of, let's let people gamble. But the technology and the technological aspects of modern sports gambling seems like a bridge too far.
I know that in the book you have some recommendations about what you think would kind of mitigate the harm for the people who are most at risk. What are some of those steps?
I would say there are two sort of big categories. The first would be legislative and on the policy side. And these are things that I don't think have to happen through regulation. I think that companies could implement them themselves. And if they choose not to, then, as you said, the states could or the federal government could. These would be things like limiting the amount of deposits a player can make within a certain period, limiting, let's say, the amount of money they're allowed to deposit over a certain amount of time, making them prove that they can afford exactly how much they're betting over a given period. And then also shortening the list of betting options. I don't think any single person in America needs to be able to bet on Malaysian women's doubles badminton at 3 a.m. Kyle, for example, was betting on minor league British darts at 2 a.m. because it was the only thing that he could bet on. And I just think what those games are is a trap for problem gamblers that make a small amount of money for companies, but it induce a huge amount of harm for the bettors themselves. So again, deposit limits, affordability checks, and a reduction in the list of betting options, I think would be sort of three that stand out to me on the policy side. And there's a whole other category that we referred to earlier about destigmatization and about sort of conversations that I think parents need to start having with their kids, particularly young men, teenage boys, about gambling, because all the messaging they're getting about gambling right now is from Kevin Hart and LeBron James and Charles Barkley during commercials, and it's telling them that gambling is really, really fun and that they can win money, and that if they have and that they're so smart and they know all about sports and they can turn that hunch into money. And I think they need some counter programming. They need to be told, first of all, the gambling can be addictive, and second of all, how easily and without any intention on their part, they can sort of fall down this rabbit hole and develop really, really severe mental health issues that will be with them for the rest of their life.
Jonathan Cohen, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
And now, the matter of weaponizing the American justice system. President Trump is escalating his pressure on the Justice Department to go after his political opponents. And inside the DOJ, career prosecutors are reeling from ousters, resignations, and relentless interference, they say, from the White House. Michelle Martin spoke with former federal prosecutor Brendan Ballou to discuss how far this campaign could go. And to note, their conversation took place just before reports that prosecutors in Virginia are moving to indict the former FBI director James Comey, who Trump considers his enemy.
Thanks, Christiane. Brendan Ballou, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Thank you.
Just to remind, you are a former federal prosecutor. You actually prosecuted cases from the January 6th attack. It's one of the reasons you left government, because of the way that things have transpired since. A number of people, analysts, people like yourself, people who understand how the Department of Justice has worked, is supposed to work, are calling this an extraordinary moment. Why are they saying that?
Well, we're watching the increasingly political nature of the Department of Justice and the collapse of the credibility of the Department of Justice. The DOJ is unlike other agencies. It's not like NASA that has spaceships or Department of Defense that has, tanks. The only thing the Justice Department has is its credibility. And to see so many attacks on that credibility so quickly, it's extraordinary. And I worry that the Justice Department that I knew may no longer exist or won't exist very soon.
Did you think it would be different? I mean, people might remember that President Trump initially nominated a congressman, Matt Gaetz, to be the head of Justice Department. It became clear that he could not win confirmation. The current Attorney General, Pam Bondi, is a prosecutor of experience. Did you think it would be different?
Maybe I was being overly optimistic or naive, but I thought that there would be at least two limits on this president's intervention in the Justice Department. The first related to January 6th, which is, as soon as Donald Trump got reelected as president, I assumed that some portion of the rioters would get pardoned. But, Donald Trump campaigned on a pro-cop agenda, and I assumed that agenda would limit his decision to pardon, for instance, rioters that attack police officers. So I thought that would be one way that Trump would be insulated or be contained. The other way is purely out of self-interest, which is the Department of Justice only works if it's able to convince judges and juries to agree with it. And when DOJ becomes increasingly political, or appears to become increasingly political, it loses that ability to persuade. And so at some level, I thought that the White House would want to keep some distance from DOJ solely so that it could be more effective. But obviously, that's not the case.
What are the sort of the data points that lead you to that conclusion?
Well, you look at the appointment of obviously unqualified U.S. attorneys to various positions in the Eastern District of Virginia, in New Jersey. These people have literally no prosecutorial experience, but because of their personal connections to the president, they're getting these incredibly important jobs. You see it in the fact that certain kinds of crimes simply aren't being pursued anymore. When you're talking about foreign bribery, when we're talking about acting as an agent of a foreign power, when you're talking about being a Russian kleptocrat, these were things that the Department of Justice used to prosecute, no longer. And I think you see it in the fact that the president is explicitly calling out that he plans to or wants to prosecute his political enemies.
So there are two things that have been in the news. The first was, and you alluded to this, U.S. Attorney Eric Siebert in Virginia refused to bring charges against Letitia James. She's the Attorney General of New York State, and James Comey, the former FBI director. Siebert resigned. He was clearly pressured to resign because he couldn't find a reason to bring charges against Letitia James. And so then, this weekend, President Trump posted on his social media platform directly addressing the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, saying, quote, "Nothing is being done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff," he's the current senator from California, "Letitia, they're all guilty as hell, but nothing is going to be done. No, I fired him, and there's a great case. And we can't delay any longer. Justice must be served now," in all caps with multiple sort of exclamation marks. So, gosh, how unusual is it for a president to be talking about demanding prosecutions of specific individuals?
It seems entirely unprecedented. I've certainly never heard of it. I've never heard of anybody that's heard of it. At one level, it's incredibly heartbreaking to see a post like that, to see the president explicitly try to use the Justice Department as a weapon against his political foes. A little bit more tactically, I think if you are the defense attorney for Tish James or Adam Schiff or James Comey, a post like that is incredibly helpful to your future defense. One thing that defendants will often try to bring is a claim of what's called selective prosecution. This idea that the government is prosecuting you unfairly for an impermissible purpose. Now, the challenge with those sorts of claims typically is it's very hard to show the government's intent. Well, here, the president just revealed the government's intent. So if the president's goal is to successfully prosecute his political enemies, I think he made that project harder for himself.
Well, the other thing is, you mentioned defendants. He says that they're all guilty as hell, but he doesn't say of what.
Exactly. I mean, it's a defendant in search of a crime. It seems clear that he wants the Department of Justice to be an arm of a larger project of retribution. I think the one good sign here is you look at how grand juries are responding to these sorts of threats. There's the old saw about that a prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich. Well, at the District of Columbia, the U.S. attorney is really struggling to indict ham sandwiches, and in a perhaps unprecedented set of cases has failed to secure indictments repeatedly. And so I think that these sorts of posts are both going to help defense attorneys, but they're also going to make grand juries more skeptical and make it harder for this administration to secure indictments in the first place. There have been a number of cases now where the grand jury in D.C. has refused to indict, proposed cases that U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro has brought. What I think this suggests is that, at least in the District of Columbia, the Department of Justice is rapidly eviscerating its own credibility and struggling to persuade grand juries to indict. I think it'll be interesting to see, with more posts like this from the president, with more proposed political prosecutions, whether other jurisdictions start doing the same thing.
But I have to ask you whether the purpose of these kinds of statements, investigations, even prosecutions, should they occur, is it really to get convictions? Or is it really more to make people's lives uncomfortable or unpleasant? It can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend yourself in a case, especially a high-profile case, where the full weight of the federal government is being brought to bear, okay? So I have to wonder, do you really think convictions are the point, or is it just to make people's lives hell?
I can't predict what the president thinks internally, but it certainly seems like he wants to prosecute these people. He wants to imprison them. He explicitly says that he's trying to get revenge for the fact that he was prosecuted. I completely agree that simply being investigated, simply being indicted, is incredibly stressful. And it's incredibly expensive, defending yourself, even if you aren't convicted, even if you don't go to jail or prison. That said, every time this administration brings an unsuccessful case, it loses more credibility and makes it harder for it to pursue political prosecutions in the future. So this is another example where I think this administration might be undermining its own objectives.
You made the point about people taking positions in the Justice Department for which they are not qualified, but it is also the case, or at least don't have any prior experience, but it's also the case that there are lawyers leaving who have specific credentials. And to that end, the public integrity section, which was tasked with prosecuting corruption, has been reportedly reduced from more than 30 attorneys to just 2. And I wonder what that says to you about the kinds of crimes that will be prosecuted or even investigated.
I think the news that the public integrity section of the Justice Department is down to just 2 attorneys shows that certain kinds of crimes and certain kinds of criminals are beyond the reach of the law in this administration. I will add that, when you're talking about an exodus of experience from the Department of Justice, one of the questions that I think every attorney in government needs to ask themselves right now, every employee in government needs to ask themselves right now, is whether they can be more effective by staying or by leaving. I think that there's always an argument that by staying in the Department of Justice or staying in government, you can stop the worst impulses of some of these political actors. But in a world where this administration is simply going to fire those who disagree with them, arguably, by staying in government, you're simply adding your own credibility, inadvertently, to these highly political actions. And so it's a very tough decision. But I think everybody in government needs to be asking themselves, how can they be most effective in maintaining the work, the dignity, and the reputation of the government they work for?
You've said that this is, quote, a great time to be a rich criminal. What did you mean by that?
Well, it goes back to what this administration is choosing to prosecute and what this administration is choosing not to prosecute. It is choosing not to prosecute people that may have committed crimes under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits foreign bribery, under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which prohibits acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign power. It's disbanded the Klepto Capture Task Force that was meant to go after Russian oligarchs. So, in all these different ways, if you are a rich criminal in America, it is a fabulous time to be working right now.
Do you think that people understand the consequences of this or the relevance of this to their own lives? And if not, who's going to make that case to them?
Maybe I'm being overly optimistic here, but the signs from the grand jury in D.C., the fact that the D.C. U.S. Attorney is struggling to secure all of these indictments is one piece of evidence that people who aren't particularly engaged in politics, grand jurors, are rarely lawyers, they're regular folks that exist in the district, that they are seeing how seemingly corrupt or misguided these prosecutions are, I think is really encouraging. In a time when so many guardrails that we expected to constrain this president have completely fallen off, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's Congress, whether it's corporate America, the fact that you're seeing ordinary citizens resist this, I think is deeply encouraging. And it suggests that maybe the tools that we thought were going to be effective in fighting against corruption and fighting against illiberalism aren't going to work, but other tools and regular people might succeed.
Is it possible that a lot of people look at this and think, well, that's just the way it always worked? And it's just more obvious now that rich people, well-connected people, there was one set of rules for them, and that other people had different sets of rules. Is it possible that many people think that's just the way it's always been, and this is just more obvious now? I don't know.
I can't speak to public polling data on this and what people generally feel about the current way that the Justice Department is being used to go after political enemies and shield political friends. And I think that there's an argument to be made that corruption is an unfortunate part of American history. So I can't speak to whether or not there's a change here or a feeling that things are truly different. But again, this is maybe an opportunity for hope, which is if this is a continuation of past corruption, it's occurring on such a vastly larger scale that it's hard for people to ignore. And when it's hard for people to ignore, maybe they're going to stand up and actually try to resist it. So at some level, this might be an opportunity to make some big structural changes.
Why should people care about this? I mean, a lot of people might think this isn't going to affect me.
Yeah.
So what would you say to somebody who felt that way?
A couple of things. So one, even if you aren't particularly political, even if you aren't breaking the law, how the government treats people, how it treats both political friends and enemies matters enormously, because due process and civil rights either apply to everyone or they apply to no one. Because if certain people are accepted from due process, it means that the president is going to be the one who decides who gets rights and who gets treated fairly, and we don't want that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we are already starting to see this corruption infecting so many parts of every American's life. You're watching the Jimmy Kimmel drama unfold right now. A lot of people watch Jimmy Kimmel. You're watching this happen in certain favored industries get protection when you have crypto scammers paying $5 million to get their investigations by the government dropped, when you're seeing banks pay $1 million to get their consent decrees lifted. This kind of corruption affects every person and it affects them every day.
How are you, thinking about all this? I mean, you took an oath, right? You passed the bar. You took an oath to uphold the standards of your profession. You went to the Justice Department. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution. And there are a lot of people like you who thought they were doing justice. And I'm just wondering, how are you thinking about this? You've mentioned several times a sort of a sense of optimism. I'm just curious where that comes from.
Well, two things. One, how am I feeling? How are my colleagues feeling? I can't speak for everybody, but it is obviously incredibly disheartening to watch the Justice Department be abused in this way and used as a political tool. It's certainly the case that, there are instances of corruption in the past, from both parties, from Watergate to, Lyndon Johnson and beyond. This is qualitatively different. You don't have a history of a president pardoning rioters who attack police because they support him politically. You don't have instances of allegations of people accepting literal cash in paper bags and then staying in office. You don't have examples of a president with business dealings where foreign governments work with them or give them literally jets in order to get favored foreign policy. So we're seeing things that are qualitatively different and on a massive scale. In terms of my optimism, what I think is because this corruption is happening on such a massive scale, it is increasingly hard for anybody to ignore. And in a world where the Department of Justice is not interested in prosecuting corruption and trying to build a fairer democracy, I think other institutions are going to step up. You know, if DOJ is not interested in prosecuting crypto scammers who pay to get their investigations dropped, well, competitors or consumers who are harmed by that behavior can sue in state and federal court to try to get justice. And so, again, I have a sense of optimism here because I think that people are increasingly engaged, and I think that engaged people have a lot of tools to take action here.
Brendan Malou, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Next to Alabama, a state that locks up more of its population than almost any country on earth. That's what inspired.
Yeah.
To break that silence, filmmakers Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman speak to Hari Srinivasan about how their shocking discoveries inspired a campaign for change.
Christian, thanks. Andrew Jarecki, Charlotte Kaufman, thank you both for joining us. You recently directed a documentary called The Alabama Solution about the conditions inside Alabama's prison system, which houses some 20,000 individuals. I mean, your film has incredible footage from inside inmates who have access to cell phones. But what are the conditions there? Because from the outside, what we see is that the state prisons are operating at nearly 200% of their capacity with just a third of the required staff. So what does that lead to?
The conditions are horrible inside Alabama's prison system, and they're deadly and they're brutal, and they are upheld by a very corrupt administration. These conditions have been documented in a Department of Justice report that came out in 2019, and further documentation followed up in a Department of Justice lawsuit. But it's very hard to understand the everyday brutality and violation of constitutional rights by just reading a report. But once you see it on the cell phone footage, there's a whole new level of understanding it on a visceral human level. And what you see is an environment where your life is threatened every day, where you are not guaranteed medical care, where there's rampant drug use, where people are being forced to work for free, where mental health crises are being exacerbated. And I think what we hope the audience will take from the film is beyond what any written legal document could provide.
Cell phone footage, these are from contraband phones, right? But how is it that so many inmates had access to cell phones, and how did you get it?
You know, I was talking to one inmate in the system and asked about how it's possible that there's so many drugs in the system and that there are so many cell phones, which was shocking to us as well. Where are they coming from? And he sort of looked at me incredulously and said, "You know, we don't leave, right?" And it struck me that it was clear these things were coming in, and we learned about this as we investigated from officers. And officers are operating a very lucrative trade in drugs and cell phones. What's unique is that the cell phones, while they're prohibited allegedly by the administration, they're actually the tear in the fabric of secrecy that we were able to penetrate because of the brave efforts of these men who are inside, who are taking a tremendous risk by sharing their stories and sharing their material.
Okay, they're gone now.
Would a regular phone call be better?
No, because it does not allow us to just be ourselves. You know, when we present our stories, we want to present our whole self, not just our voice.
You highlight a number of individual stories in the documentary, and one of those was a man named Stephen Davis who dies in prison. It's actually through an anonymous phone call that his mother hears that her son was beaten to death.
Okay, well, I understand.
Who's this?
Well, don't, I know you're grieving and mourning, but I want to tell you that your son was beaten to death by an officer. That was a murder. They sweep stuff underneath the rug all the time about this.
Tell our audience a little bit about Stephen Davis and what happened to him.
Well, like a lot of people that are incarcerated, Stephen was a somewhat troubled kid, but not very different than a lot. He went through his life and ran into some problems, especially because of drug use. And so he was in prison under the sort of felony murder statute because he was in a car with somebody who went into a house to buy drugs, and there was an altercation, and that person shot someone and then came back out in the car and forced him to drive away. So he had never pulled the trigger. And, there are many people in prison who do pull the trigger or have pulled the trigger. But he ended up in a jail where he was tased and was essentially was dead for a number of minutes until he was revived. And then after that, had more difficulty, continued to medicate himself with drugs, and ended up in one of the worst prisons in Alabama. There are 14 of those prisons. And it's clear that he got into altercation with an officer. They will say, "Oh, well, that's because he was threatening the officer." But as we hear from the informant who calls us, he says, they make things up all the time like that because they want to be able to say that the inmate was responsible and that they had no alternative but to use deadly force, which was clearly not the case. And we ended up having the ability to hear from a whole series of witnesses who were present at the time and said that was just a made-up story.
We should note that the state of Alabama, in the case of Stephen Davis, says that they maintain that Officer Roderick Gadsden's use of deadly force was warranted because Stephen Davis refused to drop his knives. Has anything happened to that officer since?
This officer was, after the death of Stephen Davis, promoted twice. So he was not disciplined, he was promoted. And then he was put in charge of the CERT team, which is the special response team that's supposed to deal with the most sensitive situations inside the prison.
I was going to say, I think one thing that we observed is that it seems that the administration made a calculation that one of the only ways you can run a facility that is close to 200% overcrowded with 1/3 of the prison staff is by greenlighting brutal tactics. But in fact, I think that brutality creates more chaos within the prison, as our participant, Robert O'Countalis, said. There's the phenomena of hand-me-down oppression. When you have officers constantly treating the population with violence and brutality, that creates a culture of violence throughout all of the facilities, and a culture of tension and trauma and PTSD. So it's really a problem that seeps through the whole system.
It's also worth pointing out that not all prison guards are like Roderick Gadsden, the man who appears to have killed Stephen Davis, along with help from some others. There are guards who are in our film who are extremely understanding, joined the prison system in order to make a difference, to try to do something good, to bring religion inside, to bring care inside to these men. But when the men are dehumanized in this way, when they're brought in and treated in this way, they start to not feel like human beings. And in some ways, the system attracts guards who are willing to and are encouraged to commit this kind of brutality.
You also focus in on how this idea of human rights inside a prison has a long history, going back to the civil rights movement and perhaps even earlier. And a couple of the people that you focus in on, Robert Orr Counsel, known as Kinetic Justice, and Melvin Ray, who after really years of suffering in solitary confinement and living in these conditions, they sort of band together and create this thing, this idea, this Free Alabama movement. And tell our audience a little bit about what that is and how they were able to orchestrate a statewide sort of work strike.
Robert Earl Council, Melvin Ray, and many other men who we spoke to but who don't appear in the film have understood for over a decade the power of the court of public opinion, and they have understood that if they can reach the public, that the public will be horrified by what's happening inside these facilities in terms of brutality, in terms of free labor, in terms of profiting off of the suffering of others. And they have, really since cell phones first appeared inside these facilities, since around 2013, have been using the devices to capture their realities and share them with the public and with the press in hopes of sparking a conversation about the dire need to change how we deal with justice in this country. And they also have always recognized the power of the importance of the economics in the situation, that this is a system that is profitable. This is a system that provides great value to the state in terms of labor, $450 million a year in terms of unpaid services and labor, and that they have the power to communicate with the outside world. And then they also have the power to, as they say, shut the system down and prevent it from profiting, and hope that that will be a lever to start a real conversation about change.
When you think about the work strike that these men have undertaken, again, it's a peaceful protest, and that's something that's so difficult to achieve in the free world. And yet these men, being restricted by tiny forms of communication, furtively being able to use cell phones to try to organize, were able to just reduce the amount of work that was happening in the prisons. And not just in the prisons, we were really shocked to find that it's not just that Alabama is using the men to sweep the floors inside the prison, which maybe people could say, well, if they're incarcerated, they should do their part. But actually, they're shipped out in vans every morning. They work in lots of state facilities, the governor's mansion, or on road crews. They work at the state fair. But also they're essentially leased to corporations. So a lot of these men who are not deemed safe enough to be released from prison are every day going to work at McDonald's, or going to work at Burger King, or going to work at KFC, or going to work at the Hyundai plant or the Budweiser distributor. They're out in the world, and yet they're not considered safe enough to be given a chance to re-enter society, which is why parole is so low in the state.
The Department of Justice had a multi-year investigation into this, and in the lawsuit that they filed against Alabama, they said the complaint alleges that the conditions at Alabama's prisons for men violate the Constitution because Alabama fails to provide adequate protection from prisoner-on-prisoner violence and prisoner-on-prisoner sexual abuse, fails to provide safe and sanitary conditions, and subjects prisoners to excessive force at the hands of prison staff. Now, for the record, we did reach out to the Alabama Department of Corrections for comment about the conditions that your film highlights. As we speak, we haven't heard back yet, but they did respond to Good Morning America earlier this month. And in that, they said the Alabama Department of Corrections is aware of the film. Production began in 2019 with footage acquired from inmate contraband cell phones. The ADOC cannot confirm or comment on the authenticity of any video footage obtained illegally. What kind of response has the state had? And I guess what's your response to them?
Well, I think the state is responding to our film in a similar way that they've responded to the Department of Justice report, which is to say, we don't agree. We don't have a systemic issue across all our prisons, and we're going to dare defend our rights to run our prisons the way we want. And I think, they can try to say that they can't validate the footage in the film, but we made our film across 6 years. And we did not just collect video footage. We also did extensive reporting through filing FOIAs, autopsies, speaking to multiple government sources, inside sources. And we have not only investigated the deaths you see in the film, but we have also investigated all deaths that have happened within the facilities since 2019, since the release of the Department of Justice report. And our investigation shows that the death rate has doubled during that time, as well as, the drivers, the preventable drivers of death, like drug, murder, suicide, have also increased rapidly. So this is a system that is still out of control, and that the proposed solutions, like building new facilities, are not realizing real results. And in fact, things are getting, have declined further. So it is still as urgent a situation as it was in 2019 when the Department of Justice first came in, as today.
I interviewed Steve Marshall, who's the Attorney General of the state, and asked him if he thought that there were serious problems in the prisons. And he said, well, there's this idea that we have some systemic problem in all of our prisons, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think that that's in part because there's a sort of philosophy that you can act like something's not happening, even if the public is, asking questions. But it just also represents the fact that these people are locked away in places that the public is not allowed to see into, right? Journalists are not allowed to go into prisons, except very occasionally in the country, because hypothetically they're like safety considerations. But the reality is these things are happening. There's nothing the state can do to prevent the information from going out other than stopping the cell phones. And in fact, that's what they're trying to do right now. So they're installing jammers and spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the information stop flowing rather than trying to improve the conditions that are obviously generating this kind of information.
I wonder, when you talk about the phones, when you talk about this sort of access to information and transparency, whether this is limited to Alabama or whether this lack of accountability and insight that we have into prison systems, whether you were able to find this type of a pattern repeating in other states as well.
I would say, the conditions that allowed for the crisis in Alabama to deepen to such a severe extent exist all throughout prisons in America. Secrecy, lack of accountability, a punitive mindset, ability to make people work for free, that exists in all of America's facilities. And I would say, yes, our film is about Alabama, and yes, our film is about prisons, but our film is also about what happens when a government is allowed to detain people under constrained and surveyed communication with little to no accountability. And that's not just happening in terms of our state or federal criminal prison system. That's happening in other arenas too. There is an urgent conversation we need to have about whether detaining people secretly and cutting them off from civil society and cutting the press off from being able to report on what's happening in institutions is compatible with a democracy.
The HBO original documentary, The Alabama Solution, is now available to stream on HBO Max. And I want to thank the filmmakers, Andrew Jarecki and Charlotte Kaufman, both for joining us and just for making the film. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching, and thanks for sharing this with your audience.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And now Trump's clashes with American universities. His administration announced plans to cut $350 million in federal grants to colleges and universities serving large minority student populations, unilaterally declaring these programs to be unconstitutional. Michael Crow is the president of Arizona State University, recently ranked the most innovative school in the country. Crow believes universities should be driving social and economic progress, and he spoke with Walter Isaacson to explain why and how. This conversation took place before the shooting of conservative activist Charlie Kirk on a university campus in Utah.
Thank you, Chris John and Dr. Michael Crow. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Walter, nice to see you.
For 2 decades now, you've led Arizona State University, the largest public university in the country. One reason it's so big is you were early on big on remote learning, on Zoom and virtual classrooms. After COVID, a lot of universities experimented with that sort of thing and went way back to more in-person learning. What did you learn from all of this, and to what extent are you adjusting how much should be in person?
Well, Walter, it's a complicated thing. We live in a country of approaching 350 million people in which we have a limited set of institutions and low levels of access to lifelong education. In fact, low levels of access to university education and underperforming and all kinds of other things. And so the lesson that we learned in COVID was that if you have a great faculty matched with unbelievable innovations, matched with unbelievable drive to continue to innovate, you can find ways to reach learners literally everywhere with the highest level of quality learning products possible. And so that's what we really learned, is that it can all work if you've got a dedicated faculty and a continuous stream of innovations.
So what are those continuous streams of innovations when it comes to remote learning? How have you tweaked or even revolutionized the process?
Well, first, we've built an innovative culture in our faculty, which allows them to be open to the process of innovation. Second, we found 400 learning technologies that we could enhance, build, further the innovative process. We've brought all those things together. We've then found a dedicated energy focusing on the learner themselves. We believe in the theories of abundance, that human beings have unbelievable potential. And then with these tools, with these learning tools, and with this dedicated faculty, what we found is, I'll give you an example. This year we'll have 35,000 engineering students. And when we started this process, we had 6,000 engineering students. We found new ways to teach calculus, new ways to teach biology, new ways to teach chemistry, enabling all the people who want to be an engineer to be able to be an engineer. That only comes through innovation in this process.
All of the people I've written about, one of the things they learned is that in the end, it's all about collaboration, that innovation's a team sport. To the extent that you're doing virtual learning, remote learning, high technology learning, do you have to work hard to make sure that the skills of collaboration are part of it?
Well, we build into our tools mechanisms for collaboration, and it turns out that most of our online learners, which is more than 100,000 degree seekers right now and 500,000 other people who are just taking courses, they're in collaborative work environments. In fact, we had some medical school deans a few years ago who were reluctant to take our online biochemistry majors into their medical schools because it said you haven't worked with anyone. These students produced a video that said, "Oh, contraire, I'm a flight medic on a rescue helicopter in Colorado. I'm a nuclear tech in the Navy. I'm a nurse nurse ER nurse, and I work in groups." And so we provide collaborative mechanisms. It's not you in the basement, with your candy, looking at lectures of talking heads. That's nothing like what we've built for our online learners. We have over 350 degree programs, 5,000 courses, all built by our faculty with these technologies, and collaboration is a part of all of that.
One of the things you've done at ASU is called the Sky Song, I think it is, in which you actually try to take research and translate it into technology, into real commercial things. That used to not be done much at big universities. And then I think at the beginning of the 70s, it started happening. Tell me how important government investment in basic research is, and then allowing you to translate that into commercial products.
Well, it's unbelievably important. One of the books that you wrote about the CRISPR Nobel Prize with Jennifer Doudna was this whole thing about, decades and decades and decades of fundamental research on enzymes, on chemistry, on proteins, on computational systems, on imaging systems, and so forth. Thousands and thousands of research groups, tens of thousands of papers, hundreds of patents. All these things allow someone like her, who you've spent a lot of time studying and understanding, to even exist. Steve Jobs, the person you wrote an entire book about, all of his creativity and his design and his genius. If you dissect and chop up the iPhone 16, it is in fact built on a platform of fundamental science, academic outcomes. Even Jobs said this himself. He was a genius of design, a genius of creativity, a genius of making things happen, of overcoming opposition. But what was he building? He was building from the threads of a fabric that had been 100 years at least academically driven, and then even longer than that.
Well, explain how basic research did help lead to the iPhone.
Well, if you look at something like The iPhone 16's got billions of transistors on the present chip. The first transistor was 1947. The first transistor was derivative of basic physics, basic math, basic computational science, basic material sciences. You couldn't design it, you couldn't build it, you couldn't conceptualize it without that fundamental science. And that's
so you've got a semiconductor research facility at ASU that's designed to do just that, and yet the Commerce Department just cut most of the money out, right? What's that?
That maneuver going. So we won in the Chips and Science Act. We won a major new lab with the NIST. We won 1/8 of the new Defense Department lab called the Microelectronics Commons. We won the State Department's funded project to secure the supply chain training. We won a $270 million project funded by Applied Materials, a company, all designed to build new underpinnings for semiconductors. And then this thing that got started late in the Biden administration called NatCast got stood up, and then they picked 3 places to build new national labs. We won one of those. Secretary Letnick has just decided to pull that back into the government. I don't know if that's, the exact status of that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to continue to fight to do everything we can to make sure that the United States continues as the epicenter of innovation, academic research, industrial research, training, advanced people, advanced ideas in all things related to semiconductors, all things digital, because that's on, so much of what the future economy is going to be based on.
Well, more broadly than just this lab, are you worried about the National Science Foundation and other funding cuts into basic research that used to be funded by government?
Well, what I'm worried about is it's one thing to take the Legos apart because you wanted to have them shaped in a new form to drive the country forward into more success. Right now, the cautionary note I would give to the people that are doing that is you're melting some of those Legos and you're breaking this fundamental process. And so it's interesting to me to think about, wanting to be the best economy, wanting the United States to be the most successful, and then taking this foundational thing, what I've called previously the invisible hand, this invisible hand of academic science, which underpins all these other things. I heard President Trump on the news talking about being the AI leaders and so forth and so on. Well, yeah, okay. Well, that requires people, chips, science, technology, algorithms, new math, new tools, new ways of thinking about things. There's nothing that's static that keeps you as the best. The thing that keeps you as the best is this unbelievable drive to innovate. And so the unbelievable drive to innovate in the modern world is heavily driven by academic science. In fact, it is the essential ingredient from which the massive integrative innovators have any promise of even being successful.
One of the reasons for the cuts in federal funding to research universities, perhaps, is the public disaffection somehow with universities, whether it be the elites like Harvard or Columbia or state universities like yours, UCLA, or whatever. What is the cause of this public disaffection, and what are you doing about it?
Well, my own view of this, and I've written a lot about this myself, is that the public disaffection comes from 2 things. One, disappointment. Most people that go to college don't graduate and they feel resentful. Most people that have debt have no diploma or degree, and that's on us. We should have not allowed that to happen. A second thing that's going on is that the universities, I think in their rhetoric and their projection, haven't always shown fidelity to the success of the United States. And so a more of a global approach to the world, which is fine. And so there's some of that going on. And I think also...
Wait, let me back that up. Unpack that for me. Not fidelity to the success of the United States. You meaning they're less patriotic than they should be?
Not patriotic as much. It's sort of like if we're going to be involved in research, yes, we want the world to be a better place, but we need American corporations to be successful. We need the American military to be a good defensive shield for the United States. And so that means we have to talk like that also. We have to be focused on those kinds of things. At the same time as there's this shared disaffection, the demand for the services from the colleges, the desire for people to have their children educated at the highest possible level has never been higher. Our enrollment, we have a 5% increase in enrollment this year over last year. We have unbelievable demand for our services. We have people breaking our doors down to want to be here from all over the world. 166 countries are represented here. We've got all this going on. And so we've got, what I think is institutional instability, because we need to do more, take more responsibility, and produce better outcomes for the United States.
A lot of universities brag about how low their acceptance rate is. In other words, they only accept 10, 12% of the people who apply. You, I think, brag about the opposite, that you accept as many possible, 90% of the people who apply. Why that different approach?
Well, so somewhere in the United States, you've got to have a standard for admission to a university, which is based on what qualifications do you need to give you some chance of success. And so we went back to the admission standards of the University of California from 1950 and the admission standards of the University of Michigan from 1950. And there you needed a B average in high school. You needed to take certain high school courses. You needed to get at least a B in those courses, and then you're admitted. Those are our admission standards. We get lots of A students also. We get lots of kids like you know, coming out of New Orleans, going to Harvard, you know, doing really well and so forth. We get those kids also. There's only so many slots for those for those students. So we have a big honors college, about 8,000 students, which looks a lot like Columbia's undergraduate college, where I used to be a faculty member. And but at the same time, we're not going to say that we're a better university because we didn't admit these fully qualified students. We also have taken one additional step, which is if you're not qualified for whatever reason, you know, your family had a catastrophic event when you were in high school. You made some mistake when you were in high school. You didn't take the right courses. You goofed off. You were a screw off or whatever. You know, we have a pathway for you to earn your way in. So some of the great research universities in the U.S., of which we are one of those, need to also be maintaining this notion of egalitarian access in the true spirit of the democracy. Otherwise, we end up with a distorted outcome of only the hyper qualified students from high school being able to go to college and succeed at college. And if we end up that way, then the democracy is not going to be successful.
Is there some lesson there for navigating the world after affirmative action, after the Supreme Court has said race-based affirmative action is bad?
Well, we didn't even read the ruling because we admit every qualified student. And so if you're qualified, you're in. If you're not qualified, we find a way to get you qualified. And so for your big public research universities, your public regional universities, your community colleges, others that are really taking the lion's share of the educational challenge for the future of our country, you don't want any admission criteria other than what is the qualification for attendance. Then you have to deal with the issue of income disparity, and most kids don't come from families that are particularly well prepared to pay for college. So we worked very hard to be able to still have. I should have mentioned that University of California in 1950 had this B-level admission standard. They also had no tuition. Their tuition was free. Now we have a fantastic financial aid package to make sure that people are not left out for financial reasons. So the only criteria that we look at for admissions is, are you qualified to perform university level work? If you are, you're admitted, and then we find a way for you to finish. We find a job for you. We find a pathway to a scholarship for you. We find a way for you to be successful, and that's allowed us to go from 8,000 graduates a year to 40,000 graduates a year.
It used to be, you mentioned it happened at the University of California, but all over the country, including when my dad went to university, you went to a public state university, it was basically free.
Yes.
Now it costs a lot. Should we go in this new knowledge-based age, like we did 100 years ago when we made high school universal and free? Should we make access to public universities free?
I don't like the word free. What I like the word is accessible. The concept is accessible. And so what we need is a way where there's not a financial barrier. You have a way to take this next step. It turns out that, college students are emerging adults. Emerging adults need to understand that nothing is free. And that you have to take responsibility for what you want to do with yourself. You have to invest in yourself. So we need an investment-based model. We need an ownership-based model. Also in high school, you're required to go. Until at least certain age in certain states. College is still your choice. And so what we've tried to build is an unbelievably accessible model in which finances will not be a barrier. 17,000 students work for us. We're thinking that at some point, with so many other learners that we're attached to, there's some possibility that all of the 80,000 students that are here with us, or the 100,000 students that are here with us, they won't have any tuition costs because they'll all be working as a part of a learning machine where we're educating many, many other people, in addition to the people that are privileged enough to be able to be here with us. And so we see an expansion of this kind of model as being a viable way to move this university forward.
Well, let me ask you about the feeders, the high schools that sending people to you. I just saw that the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the sort of national testing scores, have gone way down this year. Math, English, everything else. Is there something that you can do, universities can do, about the declining quality of K through 12 education?
Absolutely. I mean, we need to, what we said is one of the first things I did here was I figuratively went around the university and I said, we're lowering all of our shields. We're putting down the walls. We're lowering the shields. We're going to have K-12 students. We run K-12 schools. We run these as demonstration projects. We have thousands of students in them. We have a 99% graduation rate, a 90% post-secondary rate with 85% of the students coming from Title I families, that is low-income families. We have tens of thousands of K-12 learners. We have hundreds of courses that we're offering for high school students to get college credit to lower their costs to prepare them. And so the high schools have become often, there's high schools that don't teach calculus. There's high schools that don't teach much history. Well, I went to 17 schools before I graduated from high school. And believe me, some of the schools I went to, they didn't teach anything. And so we have this unevenness in this system with 15,000 school districts. What we need to do is offer to every person, every family, every learner, every kid access to whatever they need or whatever they can't get. So we've really taken that on as a mission. If every university did that, if every university lowered their shields and then made their stuff available, their libraries, their assets, their tools, their mechanisms, their courses, help the K-12 teachers, help teachers to advance, help new models to evolve, we'd be much better off, because the old model, as we're hearing from the data right now, it didn't go through COVID very well. In fact, it suffered during COVID and underperformed during COVID. And secondly, after COVID, we haven't recovered. And thirdly, we're not keeping up. And so we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're continuing to allow ourselves to see negative outcomes.
Dr. Michael Crow, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter.
Now turning to the White House, where a 73-year-old legal statute is being used to defend the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 was passed amid anti-communist fears during the early Cold War. Now, that period of history is the focus of the new book, Red Scare: Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Author and reporter Clay Ryson joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss what past political hysteria tells us about the present.
Bianna, thanks. Clay Ryson, thanks so much for joining us. First, I guess for our audience that might not have paid attention in history class, the Red Scare, why did it happen? What was it? Just set the table for us.
Yeah, so the Red Scare was a period from roughly the end of World War II, 1946, went for about a decade, 1957, although it's hard to put dates on these things. But it was a period of rampant, sort of unchecked anti-communist hysteria. There was a real reason for it. Look, there was Soviet espionage in the United States. There was the Cold War, obviously, but it got out of hand in a pretty dangerous way and scary way, where even teachers and postal workers were being called into question for their loyalty to America.
So what were the kind of underlying tensions that made Americans want to believe that there was going to be, Soviet infiltration? We were literally allies with the Soviets, and why did it turn so quickly?
Yeah, well, I think there are two reasons. One is sort of a long simmering conflict between the progressive America that came out of the New Deal, an America that was oriented more toward a pluralist vision, very much embracing of women's rights and civil rights, but also an active government. And then on the other side, a conservatism that reacted very strongly against that for a variety of reasons, some of which were pretty conspiratorial. And that simmered for a long time. The Great Depression was on, Roosevelt was popular. And then, as you said, the war started and we were allies with the Soviet Union. But pretty immediately after that, things changed dramatically so that the Soviets became our Cold War enemies. But part of that message coming from President Truman and from Congress was that this war has to be fought domestically as well, that we have an obligation to be 100% security minded. And so anyone who even has the iota of possible questions about their loyalty they have to be excluded from eventually from society, not just from from sensitive jobs, but we saw people kicked out of teaching jobs, of not giving fishing licenses because they were suspect in some way. I mean, it got out of hand in ways that are funny or would be funny if they weren't so scary.
Yeah. So what was the kind of domino effect? I mean, it sometimes when you look back in history in hindsight, you say, well, how did these people let all of these things happen? But was there kind of an incremental increase or I should say decrease in the civil liberties? What happened?
Yeah, there absolutely was. One of the things that happened very early on is President Truman, who did not really believe in the threat of Soviet espionage as a big threat. He knew that there were spies, but he didn't think that it was a problem. And he didn't think that communists were about to take over the country. But because of that, he thought he could sort of essentially buy off FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, buy off his critics in Congress with what was termed a loyalty program, where they essentially investigated anyone who wanted a job in the federal government and anyone who worked in the federal government. But the process was very poorly constructed. And very quickly, people were being hounded for tiny little blips and anonymous tips that would come into the FBI. Ultimately, tens of thousands of people were thoroughly investigated. And this had a knock-on effect with the rest of society, because as soon as the president said, this is of such concern that we're going to check everybody, then other industries followed suit. And very importantly, a lot of political opportunists saw the moment and used this fear that was boiling up as a way to go after their enemies, to raise their own profile. Ultimately, Joe McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, is the best example of this and lent his name to the era. But there were many other people like him, both before and during his reign of terror.
I wonder, this was in the living lifetimes of so many people who had just witnessed what happened in Nazi Germany, with people turning on each other, being asked and incentivized to turn in their neighbors, right? But it's like, we think about that as like some sort of bygone era. We clearly read about it in the history books. But we're talking about a decade and a half or less.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is important to keep in mind when we think back from our present moment, or maybe recent past, is how fragile civil liberties are, and how willing people are to trade some civil liberties for the promise of security. And obviously Nazi Germany is an extreme example of that. But I think in America, a lot of people saw it as a trade-off. It wasn't that they were willing to give up all civil liberties, but maybe the civil liberties of some people, maybe some of their own civil liberties, because they were being told that this was this overwhelming threat, that there were communists all over the United States who were poised to take over.
The second half of the book title is The Making of Modern America. So what were the consequences? What are the kind of long-term impacts that the Red Scare had in shaping the America that we live in today?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I mean, one is that it really put in place the left-right divide that we know today. It didn't create it. It had already been there, but it gave this sharp underline to this idea that the left is always going to be suspect for certain things that it may or may not have done, affiliation with radicalism. And it also created on the right a certain often fringe element that trafficked in conspiracy theories, was not just opposed to big government, but truly believed that the government was evil. And so while there was always, there's bipartisanship and healthy competition in the middle for decades after, there was always this undercurrent of tension and that popped up occasionally, whether it was under, the Goldwater movement or Buchanan in the 90s. So I think that's an important context. But the flip side is that we also, at least for a period, reasserted our commitment to civil liberties. And I think a lot of the achievements of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s and the women's rights movement and various other pushes for equality and for civil liberties came out of the experience of the Red Scare and a commitment, at least on parts of the left, to make sure that we didn't go back to that.
Even just in reading your book, I was several times kind of surprised by how these sort of authoritarian and in some ways fascist tendencies wrap themselves in the American flag. I mean, the idea of a House Un-American Committee is so un-American that on its face, right? But you're just like, what? How did we believe that this was the key to becoming more American, is to act less like Americans?
Yeah, well, I think there's always been a strain of thinking, particularly on the right, of what Americanism is, right? And it's always debatable. It's always debated. But there is this line about a sort of purity of thought, purity of belief and association, and that the values that are inherent in the Constitution and often celebrated by many on the right, not all, but largely on the left, over dissent and over debate. These things are inherently difficult for some people to wrap their heads around when they have that kind of narrow commitment to Americanism. And so you find situations throughout modern American history when that perspective, that idea that there is one line to walk in terms of what Americanism is, when that's empowered, it becomes very easy to decide who stands outside from that.
A lot of people are looking at this book now. It's like, wow, it's an interesting history book, and they're finding it relevant in different ways with what's happening today. And I wonder if that is too much of a stretch, if they're right to be concerned and see these parallels. Are we projecting what we want on and want to use the word McCarthyism? What are some of the things that you've seen in the last month and a half or so that you might feel like, okay, this is an appropriate analogy, this is a reasonable parallel that we should be concerned about?
Every day I wake up and there is a news story that reminds me of something from that era from my book. And I hear from readers a lot. The book was not intended to be that way. None of this was, I don't have a crystal ball. I wouldn't be writing books if I did. But there are so many parallels, and some of them are superficial. Some of them are people deploying McCarthyite tactics here and there, which people have done for a long time. McCarthy showed what worked.
So give me an example of that.
Well, so for example, I mean, just last year, Senator Vance, when he was senator, during the debate the sort of witch hunt around Haitian immigrants, refugees in Ohio, who were supposedly eating dogs. And he was challenged with evidence showing that that was not true. And he said, well, it doesn't really, I'm paraphrasing, he said, it doesn't really matter whether this or that accusation is true. The larger point is true, which is that immigration is a problem for the United States. And so, all of these falsehoods are in service of a higher truth. And that was an argument that McCarthy used all the time and his defenders used. He would say, well, maybe I got this accusation wrong against this person, but it's still true that there are communists in the government. And so I'm making mistakes, but I'm trying to get to the truth. And that's very dangerous, right? Because of course he never did find communists, but people let him do this because he claimed to be fighting for some higher truth. Now, but a lot of people use that tactic. I'm reminded, right now we have this issue, or at least in the legal community, you have a lot of large firms that are very worried about, defending clients who are accused of this or that by the Trump administration. They're afraid of speaking out. That happened all over the place during the Red Scare. Lawyers were very hard to find. If you were accused of being disloyal to the United States or accused of being a security risk, you could not just turn to your lawyer. You could not just go to any large firm. There were very few people who were willing to stand up and say, I will defend you. I will take this on, for the same reasons. They were afraid of losing clients. They were afraid of earning the attention of guys like Joe McCarthy.
So I wonder if there were turning points that you can identify now with the benefit of history that said, okay, this moment started to turn the tide, and then these two other moments really helped.
Yeah, I think look, geopolitics had a big part to play. Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the same year the Korean War ended. The Cold War kind of, if it was simmering, it kind of went back to just being, a little calmer. And so people were willing, Americans could kind of relax a little bit. But it also mattered that throughout the Red Scare, people stood up. Not everybody, and oftentimes with great consequence. But the Hollywood 10 stood up to the House Un-American Activities Committee and went to jail for it. Dozens of other Americans did the same thing and went to jail. But it mattered over time that people stood up. Edward R. Murrow stood up to Joe McCarthy and very famously produced a documentary, a 30-minute show that helped tank McCarthy's popularity, showing that he was a bully and that there was nothing else there to him except that. Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Justice, drove the court to systematically dismantle elements of the Red Scare, the tools, the architecture of the Red Scare. And while all of these didn't happen at the same time, it took time, it eventually helped remove the threat, sort of lower the fear. Yeah. And look, the House Un-American Activities Committee was around for a long time after that. Red baiting was a tactic throughout the 1960s, and I'd say continues to be today. But the fear was removed. And I think it took all of those different actors willing to stand up for it to finally come to an end.
So I wonder if, I'm a media nerd, probably like yourself as well, but is there the possibility of an Edward R. Murrow today, given that the landscape is so fragmented? Is there a moment that's possible, or individuals like that can have that kind of an impact, given that we live in these sort of filters and these our own ecosystems of consumption?
I think there is, but with this explanation, what Murrow understood was that McCarthy was a newspaper guy. McCarthy succeeded because he understood how the newspaper ecosystem worked. He understood that if he got a scoop to a journalist right before deadline, he could basically say anything he wanted because that journalist was going to essentially reprint it without checking it. But people never saw him live, or they never saw him in action. They always saw him, maybe a photograph, usually text. Murrow understood that TV would be different, that TV was something where he could just, and if you watch that documentary, it's phenomenal because it's basically just long clips of McCarthy without much commentary from Murrow. And essentially Murrow is saying, see, this is the guy. This is the person who has us all in thrall and fear. And doesn't he look like a bully? And it worked. So the analogy today is not one-to-one. But I think what I'd say is that if someone's going to come along and be that Edward R. Murrow, it's going to be someone who fundamentally understands the media ecosystem of today. And maybe it's not a journalist. Maybe it's an influencer. Maybe it's a politician. Maybe it's just someone who has something to say and it goes viral. It's hard to know, but I think that's what it's going to be. It's going to be someone who gets the moment in a way that nobody else does.
Seeing what you're seeing now and researching what you've researched, are you optimistic, pessimistic? Kind of where are you on seeing parts of history repeat itself?
I mean, I can look back optimistically and say, I see all these similarities between then and now. And I can also say, well, it ended. And it ended in part because the American people decided in a very, I mean, that's reductive, but eventually we came to our senses and said that civil liberties abuses are ridiculous. There's no communist threat. And you can see points in American history where this has happened. And so one could say, well, the present moment will chill out and damage will be done, but we'll get over it. This was Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower's fundamental belief is that Americans are pragmatic. They're not given to demagogues for a long period of time. So I can say that optimistically. Pessimistically, I can look at all the differences between, and I think this is one of the things that history is really important for. People look for parallels, but they also need to look for differences to say, here's why today is different than things we've experienced in the past. And I hope people who read the book will go through it and say, but now it's like this. Now the challenge to the legal community is coming from the president himself, and that changes the game. And that leaves me less optimistic, simply because I don't know how this ends, and I don't know if the will of the people will even matter when push comes to shove.
The book is called Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Author Clay Risen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.